And g'day and welcome to another fantastic episode of Aushammer. We are privileged to be joined tonight by the one and the only Gav Thorpe. Gav, how you going?
I'm doing great, thank you. On a nice
Wonderful.
sunny morning here.
Yeah, the time difference definitely a bit of a chat. The rest of us are chilling out here, and it's a nice, cool 8 o'clock at night in Australia. It's pretty fun. I'm joined by Scotty, our usual offender, and our latest addition, Todd. How you guys going?
Hey, what's going on, guys?
Oh, that's pretty good. So it's been a pretty busy week for all of us. So we just get into doing a bit of hobby. So I've been doing mostly my Primaris work, nothing too exciting. Just been smashing out a couple of bases, working on some pretty cool color modulation on tanks.
Painting
pretty happy with it. Yeah, just getting those tanks out to go. Scotty, what you been working on?
Working on my Primaris kill team. Painted a lot of that up. I've got two scouts to go, scout sergeant and scout with missile launcher. And I've just over the weekend got Miss L into kill team, and she's loving it. Her Tyranids basically mop the floor with me by numbers alone. So I need to really rethink what I'm doing.
That is brilliant. We did see that game. It was pretty horrific.
Schooled by your own child.
It was like 13 Tyranids bearing down on like 5 Space Marines. It was disgusting.
It wasn't.
Toddy, what you been doing? You had a kill team game today.
I did. I had a nice little mini game of kill team. I ran a mate of mine through the system, and we played Space Wolves versus my Iron Warriors, and I lost again, which is just how I play games. So that was good.
Standard. You just throw it.
Remember all the rules this time, or?
I did. But I have since thrown out all my Iron Warriors and started a new Black Legion.
Can you stick with it like an hour? 5 minutes?
They just their arms,
like 2 years worth of stuff I just kind of tipped into a vat and painted it black now. So we're moving on.
Love it.
And I've been putting together our beautiful little Irresistible Force supplied kill team terrain.
Yeah, boy.
Which is just
it's really big. Like Todd's got really big hands, but like you should hold up the terrain.
Big man.
Yeah, I'm actually like 12 feet tall, so this is huge.
This is massive. He's not that tall. He's pretty tall though.
Yeah.
And Gav, what have you been doing much hobby? You've been obviously doing a lot of work writing.
I've actually been doing some more guys for my Age of Sigmar Khorne Bloodbound. So.
Have you got any you can show us?
Well, this is what one of the completed guys looks like. I don't know if you can see him. It's a bit dark on camera, really. So yeah, I've got doing a bunch more Blood Warriors and some of the guys from the Gore Chosen game.
Very nice.
Very cool guys. So yeah, they're underway. And then at the weekend, I pre-ordered the Grandmaster edition of Adeptus Titanicus.
I'm actually gonna. I shouldn't say that. Yeah,
well,
I'm going down
to talk about Kill Team, but I'm having to take a pass on Kill Team because it's just, I'm all about the Titans. I'm focused on that. I don't need any distractions yet.
Do you suffer from the same thing that? Do you suffer from the same thing that we lowly gamers do, Gav, where you're just constantly jumping from project to project?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to. I mean, I'm a lot better these days. My time's so limited in some ways that I've got a lot better probably over the last 5 years or so of just understanding how much I can get done. So things like, I would, the guys I regularly play with, they're getting really excited about Kill Team, but I'm like, no, la 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 la. I mean, I've still got boxes of unpainted stuff. I've got my Goliaths actually for. I don't know. Actually, I'll put them on. So Goliath that I was doing, but I've not actually played Necromunda yet. It's been out however long, but I've been playing Age of Sigmar and 40k fairly regularly, which is the main thing. Actually, been playing some games which I've not done for a long while. So hence the Bloodbound guys, and got some extra bits for my Craftworld Eldar that I've been painting up some more walkers and stuff. So but yeah, I've had my eye on the Titans for the last 2 years. I've been waiting because I love Titans. So that's just going to be the chunk of it, I think, from next couple of months, really. Although at some point the Deluxe will be coming out for Necromunda, so they might. Even though I've been painting some glass, Deluxe are really my gang. They're the gang I played when we first designed Necromunda. I played in the studio campaign, so I'm looking forward to seeing them again, and that might get me playing that as well. So, yeah, not too many cool things, but it's a nice.
It never ends.
It's good to jump though from one to bounce from project to project at times, because you get sort of stale on one and then you sort of reinvigorate yourself for the next one and then the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found that because I've got this is my work desk, so I've got a little painting area here, so I can just take a break and do some dry brushing or do some bases, or it all adds up quite quickly rather than thinking, like, sit down and spend 2 hours painting and get this stuff done. It's just like, I'll just do that next bit. I'll just do the washes on these guys or whatever it might be. And it, over the course of a week or a couple of weeks, you can get quite a bit done like that. And it saves me getting distracted on Facebook and stuff and things like that when I just want a 5-minute break and have a think. Actually, it's quite nice to do some painting instead.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
So that's my hobby.
Plenty then. That's good. So, Brinley, you there still? Yeah.
Yeah, buddy, I'm still here. We just a viewer just sent a message, and we're just having a bit of a technical difficulty. Apparently, it's all just stuck on me at the moment. So we're just trying to sort out some stuff in the background. But I believe Gav has a very, very exciting new book that's coming up that I think we should definitely hear about in the near future. Do you want to tell us about your latest book, Wild Rider? Wind Rider?
Yes. Yeah, Wild Rider. So
Wild Rider, there we go.
Wild Rider is so book 2 of Rise of the Ynnari, my current Aeldari series. First one was Ghost Warrior, which was out about a year ago, just under a year ago. So Wild Rider, as you might expect, has Ivrain and her friends travelling to the craft world of Samhain and loads of jet bikes. And I wrote a short story which was out earlier this year called Fireheart, which reintroduced the character of Nathu Fireheart, who was someone I invented for the Codex Craft Worlds in 3rd edition 40k many years ago.
Wow.
As the guy who rides on the back of a Viper and is the Lord of the Wild Riders. So, I mean, basically all I've been doing with these stories is just going back to old rope that I wrote years ago and putting them into books.
This is actually really cool.
And Ghost Warrior, it's like, I wrote this character 20 years ago.
That's cool though. Like you've had them sitting there for so long, and that you've been able to bring them out into your books. That's got to be cool though.
Yeah. It's nice.
Gav,
It's good to have that continuity, I think. So.
It was the 3rd edition Eldar Codex and that Craft World supplement that you wrote. That was my first taste of Warhammer.
Right. Okay.
So Fireheart was like one of the first characters I ever saw in 40k.
Right. Oh, that's cool. Well, you like this then?
Yeah, it's nice to see. It's nice to see that old lore getting some love again.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's. I mean, with the whole Ynnari thing, that's kind of where it's come from. Was sort of some throwaway references back then that have been the narrative guys in the design studio have kind of obviously built up into a big part of the current story arc in 40k. So actually, it's nice to go back to that period. Like I say, looking at Iana Ariana in Ghost Warrior, going back to Fireheart for Wild Rider. So in the short story Fireheart, basically we have an emissary of the Ynnari comes to Samhain Craft World, basically asking for help, looking at as part of that ongoing quest, I suppose you might say, looking for sort of ancient artifacts and things from the time before the fall, which might lead them to the locations of the Crone Swords. I've just had a message I'm presenting to everyone. Oh dear.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. You're good to go. I just had to lock onto you, try and get it off me for some reason.
Right. Cool. So there's a maiden world that nobody's heard from for a long time, but the Ynnari want it's near Samhain, so they want them to go and have a look there to see if there's anything interesting for them. There's a bit of politics going on, but basically Fireheart decides that he's going to help the Ynnari as much because he quite fancies the emissary and wants to impress her.
Oh, isn't that sweet?
So they go down, and it turns out the reason that this maiden world hasn't come, hasn't turned into anything in particular, and the exotites disappeared, is basically because it's also it's become a Necron tomb world. So they accidentally awaken the Necrons by their interference. So Wild Rider is the follow-up to that. That's kind of the prologue. But Wild Rider, the novel opens with sort of essentially the news that this tomb world is awakened close to the craft world and isn't very happy, and the Necrons on it aren't very happy. But they figure they're still protecting something. There's some kind of vault in this Necron city. So the Ynnari and some of the Nuathu and his clan and some of the Wild Riders and things join forces to go and try and find out what's in this vault, because they figure if the Necrons are protecting it, it's probably something the Necrons
There's probably
don't
something
want
decent there. Absolutely, yeah.
So, and then, as I usually say, hijinks ensue, and so we get to see. So we cover. I mean, the characters in it. We follow Ivrain, Nuathu Fireheart himself, and a few of the other minor characters. One of the other things I did recently was another short story. I can't remember what it's called now. Shadows of Heaven, I think it's called, where the character from the last of the Eldar Path trilogy, Aeldari, who was a ranger for most of Dawn, a pirate and stuff. Essentially, in that short story, he comes across the Ynnari. He's saved by the Ynnari, basically, and he joins them. So he's one of the characters in Wild Rider. So we get to see, sort of from a new recruit's point of view, what it's like to become a Ynnari. What does it mean, leaving the craft world? What is it that Ivrain does? How do you connect to the Whispering God? What is the Whisper itself that they hear? All that kind of stuff. So, yeah, he was very much a character. People will be aware of him from the Path of the Eldar books, but also he just gives me an excuse to delve into some of that stuff about what makes the Ynnari different to everybody else, and it throws up some problems because some of it you think, well, okay, So there's, it's a lot of the questions that people are asking, like,
I was going to say, so it answers some questions.
Yeah. I mean, his mentor is a former Drukhari captain who goes back, way back with Ivrain. So he gets to see a little bit of it. There's little snippets of what it's like to become a Ynnari from the Drukhari point of view and how that interacts with the thirst and things like that. So not a huge amount in terms of the Drukhari point of view, but from the Craftworld point of view, this idea of being freed from the curse of the fall and what the salvation offered by the Whispering God actually is, and all this kind of stuff. So, as well as this sort of romping adventure across a Necron maiden world type thing, and we've got there's a few POV sections from the Necrons as well. From this, they're led by a character called the Watcher of the Dark, I think. So this character is obviously guarding something, but she can't even remember what she's guarding. This Necron.
Oh wow! So they've been there she's been there so long that it's been there so long that it's just forgotten why. Like, just got to stand here and guard, and I don't know why. I just have to.
That's right, exactly. And again, I just had a bit of fun with that. There's a whole kind of waking up sequence when she comes to sort of full consciousness, and not realizing it's been 60 million years and all the rest of it. So there's a nice little nod. And there's again, through the Ynnari and also through the Necron tier, and having both of them together, and the whole theme of death and what happens in the afterlife for the Eldar and all that kind of stuff. But also looking back to the very origins of the beast, really, and the time of the old ones and all that kind of stuff. So, the idea that I like playing around with the idea of time in the Eldar. That obviously some of the books I've set are 10,000 years ago in terms of the Imperium, but they seem fairly recent for the Eldar. But this one is like, no, actually, this is going right back to it. This is, 30,000 generations ago.
Way before the Imperium was thought about.
Absolutely.
What we can see from. Yeah, absolutely.
And again, I quite like with the Eldar novels. One of the things I like doing is making it very much focused on them. So again, there are no humans in this book at all. I think the next one there will be some humans actually, because it's quite nice to see the Ynnari with some humans. But there's this whole other story going out there in the galaxy which doesn't involve the Imperium at all.
Yeah, so, that's the thing. The galaxy is so big that you can have these stories and all these things happen, and no one else knows about them, but themselves.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So
it must be really cool being able to, like, as Scotty just said, having that whole galaxy. You're kind of like taking over a little pocket with your lore, and because you've been writing for such a long time, and being able to bring in old characters from former books and tie them into this. Is that like do you have like a grand picture, so to speak, when you're approaching this task, or is it just kind of like let's just pull the yarn ball and see what unravels from it, sort of thing?
I think it's a mixture. I mean, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't. There's usually sequences I have. So like with when I was doing the Legacy of Caliban for the Dark Angels, again, without necessarily knowing what was going to happen with the main storyline and stuff, but I had an idea of what I wanted to happen in the third book. So it kind of all built towards that. And so, whereas this one's a bit different, I suppose. The advantage of the Ynnari, and why I really enjoyed writing it, is that they've got a huge amount of agency to just go anywhere and interact with anyone, fight anybody, or alongside anybody. Humans.
Yeah, they operate really differently from everybody else, don't they?
So the next one actually will be more focused on the Drukhari. They're going to return. Yvonne's going to return to Camorra after she left it in a bit of a mess. And kind of fun times there. Again, I don't know the details of the story, but so I suppose for this series, it's more of a what the world building is kind of like, well, what interesting people can they go and meet and interact with, which is going to show us something different about them and the other side. So yeah, I focused on a couple of craft worlds for the first two books, but each one again has got quite a bit of a what if. So what if the Necrons and the Aeldari, what happens when they're fighting? The first one was about what if there's a craft world that's been out in the wilderness for a long, long time, and what might have happened to that, without giving away too much for people that haven't quite read it yet. But there's a few interesting things. Again, there's a few what ifs in there. And it's similar when I'm doing with the Phoenix Lords novels. Again, a lot of these are very much going back to the time of the fall or shortly thereafter and things like that, and looking at different ways the Eldar coped with the fall that didn't necessarily make it into a Codex army. There's sort of like little pockets of different cultures and factions out there that may still be around, or they may have died out and things like that.
Possibly survived, but not sure yet, or whatever. Yeah,
and trying to explore beyond what's established in the codexes and the gaps in between, really, without contradicting everything in the codexes. But
is that hard? Is that hard to do, to write your story and still have the what's in the codex in the back of your mind, to not contradict yourself, not to double tap on things potentially? And is that, or do you just sort of go with it and then edit later and work around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly with something like the Ynnari and the Eldar, because it's fairly contained within a few books, so keeping abreast of it is quite straightforward. The bigger, and so although there's a lot of big picture stuff, most of it's not. It's so big, it's so mythological. A lot of the Ynnari stuff, it's not necessarily going to change. A lot of the setup was in the Gathering Storm books and things, but actually, and that kind of set the new present. The present is fairly static in a sense, and probably not going to find the last Crane sword and destroy Slash anytime soon or any of that. So that actually gives me quite a lot to play around with. Well, that was one of the things. Again, trying to find a way to write a series of books which there's a sense of accomplishment without them ever. I'm not going to be allowed to just write in a book. Oh, and by the way, they found the Crane sword and they've destroyed caves.
That draft didn't quite make the cut.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll love the day when they hand you up. When they hand you an envelope and they're like, "Here, you can actually say it now. There you are."
That's it. Yeah, that would be cool. I'd love to do that reveal. I don't think I'd get away with that. So yeah, the idea behind, I suppose, Ghost Warrior and Wild Rider, in a sense, kind of broadening out that mission statement of the Ynnari. So it's not just as simple as we find this, we're just looking for this one sword, and then we save everybody. It's more a case of what does it mean to return return the different Eldar kindred back to the idea of the Aeldari, this unified race, this unified species that existed before the fall. And how that ties in with the pantheon of the gods and all kinds. So Vrain starts making some strange connections and things about the people around her and what she's doing and stuff like that. Some of which maybe she's aware that could be pure speculation, but some of it might be, is this even the first time this has happened? As she becomes aware of that huge time span of people and the idea of the cyclic nature of their myths and things. It's like, well, was there even only one fall? Is this just part of the cycle?
True. Yep.
Again and again, because that's what
shocking reveal
the Eldar are based on. Do they splinter and then reform? How do the gods and the myths feature into this? Are they really dead, or are they reborn in another way? Because of course, again, Ynnari and the rebirth and all that kind of stuff is part of that. So, if the Aeldari themselves can be reborn, does that mean their gods can be reborn? Are they really dead, or are they just basically waiting to be awakened as well?
Right. That's
a lot more interesting than just looking for a sword.
It's so much to process.
But and chatting to Phil Kelly about this is sort of some of the stuff he's been seeding into the background, and some of the stories and things as well. So it's not I'm not, this isn't me just charging off on my own doing this sort of thing, but actually because he's a huge Eldar nerd as well, so these are the things that we think's cool, and in some ways having the novels to explore it is, I've got a bit more freedom, again, as long as I don't break anything particularly in terms of exploring themes and stuff. Novels might be a bit better place to do that than codexes, because they've got a lot of concrete information to try and get across. So
that's always good to have someone to bounce some decent ideas off and have a sounding board of sorts to give you a guide as well. That's always pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that's when stuff meshes together, so that because again, with a lot of the Eldar background, because there's the way it's developed over the years, and partly because of the way I've developed it over the years, and Phil has after me, and talking to people like Jez Goodwin, who's always had some ideas about it. Things, these themes and ideas you can build on, and they always feel like, well, maybe this was always the case. It's one of those that there's such a strong foundation of ideas there that as you continue to explore them, a lot of them just make sense. They, it's like, well, of course, this is how this works, or this is how the metaphysics of the spirit stones works this way, or whatever it might be. Yeah. And it feels like it's actually, well, it's always been true. We're just revealing it now. We are just making it up, but actually, there's such established lines to follow in terms of how it kind of works. The underpinnings are really strong. So
so you've turned the ideas into actual canon for the Ynnari, basically.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And again, the Ynnari are a great vessel, I suppose, for doing that, because they can interact in these different ways. Because what they are is right at the heart of the idea of the Ynnari, the Aeldari, and being, are they doomed, standing upon that precipice? And again, I've not even touched on it too much, but going forward, more in their connections to the Harlequins and how does that work out. There's loads of questions that I've kind of skirted around a little bit, but well, because so for example, exarchs are priests of Cain, and the aspect warriors are sort of like they're dealing with their issues and their anger issues through being warriors and stuff like that. So how does that work when you have aspect warriors within the Ynnari?
Right.
Or another one again hinted at is the incubi, the coiled blade that follow the Vizarch, and what's their deal? They're incubi, they're supposed to be mercenaries, they've got their whole shtick. So what were they offered that meant that they would follow him across to the Ynnari and things like that? Things just to hint on as well,
So basically, like you were saying before, just to put a little bit more oil on the fire and not.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, well, some of it's really, like, well, I don't want to kind of preempt
too much
what the studio might say, because we haven't had an Ynnari codex. We've had what came before, But actually, obviously the codexes that have come out are focused pretty much on those factions, with little hints to how they interacted with Ynnari in the background of it. But so to kind of come out and say exactly, the other thing I don't know is whether how much of this has been thought about, or what starts as a good idea of like, well, you can pick and mix from Harlequins and Dark Eldar and Craft Eldar. It's cool, just make up your army. But then actually once you start thinking through the implications in terms of the background, it's like, okay, that's
You're like writing all the bits that make the armies work, don't you? Like you can come up with a codex and go, oh, it's cool. Take this unit, make this army. But reality is how would the social structures of those kinds of things? What would happen if you put Azaruman on the field?
Yeah. Well, that's all. Where all these stories kind of overlap with the Ynnari, with the Phoenix Lords, and with the idea of the Ranadandro and the end times and all that kind of stuff. So each one is just a narrative that could be explored, really, either in part or as part of a whole book. Having done the James R. novel, it'd be interesting to bring her into the Ynnari series, because she's been as one of the advocates of Ivrain and things, and how does that work? And having explored a bit about the origins of the Phoenix Lords in those novels, and how does that tie into Ivrain's growing ideas of the eternal cycle of the Eldari and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's at least one.
They're all about rebirth.
Sorry,
the Phoenix Lords. Their entire gimmick is about rebirth, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like every time that they come back, it's all just teaming up together from the past.
Yeah, and but exactly. They've got their own path and destiny that they think they're following, but the whole Iliad boulder in the pond has kind of disrupted all the lines of fate and things like that, and Eldrad, by trying to essentially short circuit destiny, has created all of this stuff. Eldrad again is another one of those interesting characters who has got a lot of history in the real world as well, with stuff that may or may not have happened in the Eye of Terror, but actually he's been involved in a lot of stuff, but he's also a character that's been around for a long time, since the second edition Eldar Codex and things like that. So having him associated with the Ynnari, and sort of how does again, showing us a way of why would a Farseer be interested in working with the Ynnari, and again, how does that work? And one of the things I've done in a couple of the books really is hinted at the idea that with Eldrad's help, really, that the Farseers arose out of an older cult of the oracles of Morai Heg, the crone goddess, who used to be like the seers and cast runes and have these kind of weird bloody rituals and things like that. And then sort of Eldrad was one of those, while Aushammer was running around kind of teaching everybody the path and how to control their emotions and things, Eldrad was creating this runic system out of the kind of remnants of the Morai Heg cult, which kind of essentially was why he was pretty much one of the earliest Farseers. And the idea of exactly, again, talk about the history, the idea that obviously what's presented in the Codex is what's now in the craft world particularly, but that wasn't the case necessarily 10,000 years ago. And how these things interacted was probably slightly, these things took time to evolve. Craft worlds didn't form as they are now, fully created out of the fall. They took, one or two generations for all of these things to be spread and learn and everything else. So, and I really enjoy that, actually looking at what those stages along between terrible, sort of like cults, essentially cults of Slaanesh in various different guises that weren't aware of it, up to, and then sort of like the spectrum of that up to how the craft worlds are today. And so in Wild Rider, again, there's a bit, so looking at, essentially, I said that the craft world, Samhain, was one of the last ones found, actually, by the Phoenix Lords. So it had to survive for a while on its own, and that obviously came up with its own systems for dealing with the Fall and Slaanesh, and the concept of the Wild Rider and the clans that they've got, which makes kind of what sets them apart, was their survival mechanism, basically. The Wild Rider idea being that a bit like the Outcast idea, really, but without leaving the craft world, in that when you're a wild rider, you can pretty much indulge every whim and fantasy and idea that you want for that period of time and get it out of your system, and sort of like
and be done with it, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And then after that, then you can you'll settle down, and that could be anywhere along your time. It's been incorporated with the past now, so it could be, usually it's when they're younger, but actually Fireheart, he's actually a bit older than usual, and he's been doing it for longer. He probably should have finished by now. He should have got it out of his system by now, but he's
a bit too indulgent.
He's a little bit, yeah. There's a whole kind of, his whole story is about he's the heir to his clan, and his father's ill, but he's got this kind of weird spiritual malaise. It's not like a physical disease, but he's kind of something's killing him, and Nathu's just not at all interested or confident about taking over leadership of the clan. And he's got half sisters. There's a whole politics with the other clan through his half sister, trying to, their fortunes have waned of the last couple of generations, and they're no longer regarded the way they were. So the reason he's kind of almost so performative in his heroism and things is an attempt to restore the family name and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of, as well as the grand scheme of Ynnari and things, there's made sure there's a very personal story at the heart of it.
I was going to say, there sounds like a lot of pressure on one being's shoulders to try and to get through.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's what it's something he's kind of rejecting, which is why he's still acting out.
That's why he's still kicking out.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's a rebel
at the same time, also, and he can't really, as well as from a selfish point of view, but also just from an emotional point of view, can't really envisage his father dying and not being there, and so as well as actually having to get the responsibility to prepare to take that position is an admittance that his father's going to die. So there's a whole thing going on there as well. So yeah, in many ways he's kind of gone the other way, and is almost deliberately irresponsible and headstrong and everything else, almost trying to prove that he's not ready, and that will keep his father alive somehow.
Like, my kids throw tantrums, but that just sounds like a little bit too much.
Well, that's exactly what the Aeldari are. I've always just said, is like, they are basically the worst teenagers ever. Because they have the path is there to control all these raging emotions.
Do you get that, like because the Aeldari are like the new emerging powerhouse amongst all the Eldar factions, and they're more or less going out of their way to try and sway everybody to their cause, sort of thing? Is it like some youth revolution that they would like get everybody together and all come over to our place and try this? Your dying's not so bad. We've got a god.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. It's very much shaking up the status quo. And one of the issues that arises in Wild Rider, because their actions have threatened the craft world, and basically Bill Town are not happy with them, for breaking their craft world. Orthway are not happy with them, and particularly with Eldrad for essentially tricking them and trying to steal Farseers and all that kind of stuff. And so it comes down to sort of like, well, the last thing we really need is another craft world against us, so one of the powerful ones. So it's why they kind of make overtures towards them to try and an alliance between the Ynnari and Samhain craft world, simply because as much as they're a faction in their own right, they rely, and they've got a fleet and things. They don't really have a base. They don't have, they still need friends amongst the craft worlds and potentially friends at Camorra to help them do what they need to do. Otherwise, they'll be a bit adrift, really, from the rest. They don't want to just be another outcast faction that everyone will then ignore, basically. They're not a pirate fleet. They need to be something a bit more. But actually, they're still struggling a little bit with that. So, yeah, it very much comes down to there's a choice later on about, well, do we cut our losses and go and abandon the craft world to its fate, or do we not? And what's the pros and cons? It's like, well, if we stay right, we could get wiped out. But what's the point of surviving if essentially nobody's going to trust us ever again to ever want, considering they have to recruit from everywhere else.
Yeah.
Although that's another question that, I don't know, at some point, it's like, well, there will be Ynnari babies at some point. So
it sounds like you're creating more questions than you're answering, just
so
quietly.
We'll leave that for a few novels,
Yeah.
Before we have the first Ynnari baby. But
once Slaanesh takes root again, then we'll start playing around with that idea.
Yeah.
Does the prospect of going back to Commonwealth, you know, I was going to say, does that excite you? But I guess, you know, writing that it would. It just seems like a really, really cool place to focus a story, or to be able to draw from the Drukhari and bring them like across the threshold now as characters.
I know that's definitely the idea. Like I say, having had a look at a couple of craft files, using the Ynnari as a means to go back to see what's happening in Camorra since sort of like it broke, and her relationship, not particularly Vrain's relationship with Vect and with Lelith Hesperax, who is kind of like would be the titular character really of the third book. We've had Iona Ariana, and we've had Nasu Fireheart. So the idea, somebody else suggested, actually a friend of mine just said it'd be cool to have one that was focused around Lelith Hesperax. So and she's innate, again, she's part and parcel of Ynnari's story and a Vrain story in the Ynnari and things. So it seemed natural to go back and catch up with what's happened in Camorra since it all broke and demons tried to get in. And so on the one hand, because I think
since you filled it with demons, Gav, that's what you did.
Yeah.
Since you flooded it with demons.
But I like the idea that maybe the Ynnari need to maybe use some human help to get there. In a way, there'll be something about the Webway or something that maybe, because again, I'd like to see a bit more interaction with Vrain and some humans again, because we've not seen that really since the actual Gathering Storm. But who or how, I don't know. That's like the idea, but I'll be right.
That's me. You just need to flesh it out, really, and
Yes, yeah, and then after that, we'll see. And it's also about, again, thinking about the antagonists and who's going to be up against the Ynnari in this particular thing. And it might be something as straightforward as being Vect, or it could be the demons or something. I don't know, exactly why they need to return. I've got the what and who, but I don't know quite what the actual plot is or why they're going.
Would they let you dig up the old fallen Phoenix Lord?
Well, this was part of it. Yeah, I mean that was an ongoing question really for when I was doing about the actual Phoenix Lord series. I mean, originally the conversation was there would be 6 of the 6 original Phoenix Lords from the second edition Eldar Codex. But we've always with the possibility that we might look at the Fallen Phoenix. We might look at some of the other, the Forge World Phoenix Lord, the Shining Spears guy, and things like that. Who I read in the Codex, of course, was sort of the original Shining Spear was there at the end. So obviously he was around during the fall. So not somebody who came along later and was actually responsible for banishing Ynnari when the first shrine was destroyed. It's like, oh, okay, so he was fairly important then. And it was, but this was in a bit of a war gear description for the Twilight Lance or something like that. It's like, really? Okay. That was a bit.
So,
I'm glad I didn't miss that. It's like, I'll just war gear. We'll skip those pages. And this is one thing we run into now and again. Talking about incorporating everything, it's got to be very careful to have these discussions to make sure there isn't like a line in a timeline somewhere where something. Oh yeah, and by the way, that guy's dead, or or did this thing that you forget about. There'll always be little inconsistencies, I suspect, because.
Well, when you've got so many hands-on over decades of work, that's bound to happen.
Yeah, I think it's doing it knowingly, really. It's like, well, actually, that doesn't quite work, or there's these 2 different versions of things, so let's pick which one works best for this story. But, and also just, it's like longer term, having conversations like, well, do I want to have a tilt at doing something with the Exodites, But is that treading on toes too much in terms of trying to define who they are through a novel rather than through the design studio doing it, which is the proper way. But if they're never going to get round to it, if it's one of those genuine questions like, well, yeah, we'd love to, but to be honest, we're never going to design an Exodite army, then it'd be nice to, I did little bits and pieces in the Path of the Eldar series, but actually it'd be nice to have a novel where the Ynnari try to recruit some Exodites. Oh, yeah, really? Okay. But that would mean fleshing out a whole swathes of the Eldar background that hasn't been explored in any real detail at all.
No, you've got
that's
a
the
lot
appeal.
of- Yeah.
So just quickly, some of you may notice that we have audio only at the moment during our feed. The problem is because we've actually Google Hangouts has somehow managed to run 2 casts beside each other, and we've actually got 2 chats that are individually recognized. We've got one with Gav and Todd, and then we've got the other one with myself and Scotty in it, and it's not actually picking up any visuals other than mine. So I actually just cut the feed instead of you guys watching me in my beanie the entire time. So that's why I've been quiet for a bit. I've just been busy plugging away trying to work out what's going on here. But we've got audio only. There's nothing wrong with the audio, and yeah, so
in the background.
lots of audio. And let's be honest, I'm pretty sure no one's going to complain if they can't see our faces.
Yeah. They're not here for me.
They're not here for looks. They're here for a fantastic interview, which is definitely happening at the moment, and it's been really good. So I just thought I'd throw it in now because I'm sure people are just like, why is there no visual stuff? And we'll just throw it in later. For those of you who are still with us, 3 viewers, thank you for joining us. It's absolutely amazing to have you here. David Mayman, I know you're in the chat. I can see you. Thank you for telling us that it was just my face on the thing. So I have some burning questions about ancient Eldar lore, if you'd be kind. If I could pick your brains on them for a little bit. Yep. All right, so it's speculated.
Can I jump in 1 second? Before we move away to ancient Eldar lore, Gav, all 6 Phoenix Lords are in a room and they have a fight. Who would win?
Oh, here we go.
Oh my God.
Before we move from the Phoenix Lords.
How big's the room? How far away can Morgan are?
It's about the size of your average English bar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, how high can Barroth fly?
Down at the local pub.
Yeah, Asherman taught them everything they know, even if they did take it on anywhere else. He was the original one, the best. So, I think he's the Sensei Wu of them all. So, as much as if they did have a big fight, he would be the one who, to be honest, he'd be the one avoiding most of it and letting them just beat each other up, and at the end finish off the last one probably in a kind of Rumble Chris Jericho.
Brutal.
Yeah, so I tried to get that across. I think in the books a little bit is that as much as he's probably not the sexiest in terms of like the cool Bernie guy or the fly one, he's the centre of it. He's the one who created this system of thought and the discipline. He is the he's the one from which their power stems in some way. He is the incarnation of Asuria and I think whether the rules reflect that's another issue, but he should always be the one. Like I say, he's the sensei master. He's the one that, as much as the other guys get really good and stuff, they can never actually quite lay a finger on him. He's always just that one step ahead,
one little bit ahead,
getting them to trip over, doing the things, smack them on them, arse with his sword or whatever. But and if he wanted to, could absolutely finish them.
Suck it, Morgan Ra.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Well, you can just imagine doing it. It'd be like the bit from the second Deadpool movie, Morgan Ra firing off shurikens, and but then it'd be just full of shurikens at the end of it. Everybody's like, "Oh, I'll come back for another go in a few years."
Yeah.
I feel like it's a side story that you should write. Like, the Phoenix Lords walk into a bar and then just go from there. Huh?
New short by Gav.
Oh yeah, Swagan is the one that's going to start it because he's the one with all the anger issues. So he's the one who's going to get his drink spilled. You looking at my axe, that sort of thing.
He's got an axe. It's such an odd weapon for an Eldar, an axe.
Yeah, it's triangular, so I suppose he gets away with it.
Yeah, definitely a bit different.
Yeah, you don't tend to get many axes for the Eldar.
No.
True. And the other thing is nobody knows where Clarendras is because he's just hiding.
Just chilling out.
He's in one of the cubbies. Just having drinking his mysterious goth cocktails.
He's got a straw coming out of each of his needles just down the
It's good for your cans. You know,
keeps destroying the cans with his claw. Ah! Get me a straw. I feel like this is something that should be explored in fiction, and like fan fiction at the very least. If any fan fictions out there, fan fiction writers are out there, definitely smash out the Phoenix Lords at a bar.
Yeah.
Flesh out that drunken personality.
That's it.
Oh,
Jan's
okay, so
Jansen Coyote Ugly style.
Oh man, that's disturbing. I love it. So I've been listening to a couple of other podcasts that have been speculating on Eldar lore, and a couple of questions I had. All right, so were you involved with all the pre-fall lore for the Eldar? Like War in Heaven, War with the Necrotar.
Some of it, yeah. I mean, I was mostly on the Warhammer team when the sort of like the first Necron Codex was done, and obviously it's been revisited a couple of times and fairly drastically updated / changed over the years. But I mean, yeah, they were part and parcel of those conversations. Although I did recently find out, having written some stuff in Wild Rider, that it may be some bits of that are my personal interpretation, which don't necessarily match up to what was in the established background. We'll have to see.
Oh, excellent!
We'll see.
Right.
Everything comes with the caveat of, I don't work in the narrative team anymore, so.
yeah, absolutely. So the question is, when the Eldar, obviously, initially the old ones, did they create the Eldar as weapons?
I think yes. Purely for the reason that the 40k cosmology in prehistory mirrors the Warhammer one. And in Warhammer, it's very clear that the old ones create elves and dwarves and humans and things as weapons against chaos, as the Warhammer world's about to fall. So on a cosmological scale, unless something else is massively different, I always just translate that. Warhammer was the spring of that cosmology and then was turned into a science fantasy setting. So although lots of it has changed, that concept that there was that the old ones created the original idea, as Rick Priestley explained it to me many years ago, was that 60 million years ago there was some galactic catastrophe which may or may not have been enslavers or a war against chaos or something which threatened them, and then essentially the old ones created these various survival plans, the ideas which became particularly the Eldar and the Orcs as sort of like slightly older races, but also humans and everything else. He always basically said that humans were the dinosaurs' survival species. The humans were created by the dinosaurs as a way of trying to survive this galactic catastrophe. So I've always kind of stuck with that. And in Wild Rider, particularly, it kind of nods towards, maybe erroneously, it turns out, but nods towards more emergence of chaos and things like that. But yes, it's one of those areas that's kind of been slightly tweaked, and how the Necrons fit into it slightly different, in that it seems the case that these days the Necrons evolved. The Necrons weren't created, the original Necron race. They were a naturally evolved species, but obviously ended up tangled in with the Catan, who obviously had their own ends for what they did with the Necron tier, and turned them in many ways into a weapon against the old ones, and turned them against the old ones for what happened to them. So yeah, I mean, for the most part, the Eldar, and definitely what's intimated in Wild Rider, is that the Eldar were created as a psychic race, as not necessarily chaos itself, but the perils of the warp in its many forms. That the Eldar were supposed to be, like the elves were in Warhammer, were created to be a resistance against that.
Oh yeah. Okay, so the Phoenix Lords and the Elder Gods. So were the Elder Gods? Did the Elder create? So were the Elder Gods? Were they originally created by the Elder? So if that makes sense. So were they weapons created by the Elder?
We really don't know. Well, it's one of those things. It's those mythic cycles and the idea of again, quite a bit was done in the War in Heaven, which kind of, there's been a bit of a kind of terminology bleed as well over the years, over the decades, because originally the War in Heaven was a very Eldar event, which was about Cain fighting the other gods and essentially and killing Eldanesh, and kind of like a Paradise Lost kind of sort of idea. The Aeldari and their gods were sundered from each other, and things like that. And then it became an original Necron sort of background. It stepped sideways into being a bit of a metaphor for this galactic conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrons and the Catan and the Eldar and all this sort of stuff. And in the same way, the swords of Vol, that were forged for Cain, were they actual swords? Were they spaceships? Were they? The idea is it's always never quite certain whether these things were, are they genuine myths of 100, 1,000, brilliant warriors. Was one of the things I did in the Path of the Eldar. I think it's in the first one, Path of the Warrior, I think, and he gets the Colandriel, the character, gets injured, and the healers, they don't really do healing. What they kind of do is awaken the healing properties already innate within the Eldar. That their bodies are already very good at rapidly healing and things. But it's called it's kind of like this called the Tress of Isha. So, but whether it's was it a genuine gift from a goddess Isha? Is it just what they've decided to call this property that could be awoken? Is it in itself an analogy for some was Isha some early Eldari geneticists who created this thing? Who knows? That's the idea, I suppose. It could be. Even the Eldar don't necessarily know the origins of these things anymore. They just know the myths, and learning the myths is what they learn. So, so where the gods are the gods old ones? Are they weapons? I don't know. The fact that when you start exploring it, because you have to think of, well, what have we said and how does it interact and how does the metaphysics work? And particularly with the fall, what we have is a very specific event. It's as much as we've not detailed much about Eldar society before and after and things, we do know that their nascent hedonism and everything else created Slaanesh in the warp. And that creation essentially destroyed the other Eldar gods. And if those Eldar gods were physical things, that seems a bit weird. If they weren't actual warp entities or things in of their own right, or were they purely concepts, that the idea that they got lost. But we also know there's an avatar of Cain sitting in the middle of every Karth world. So there was a thing that broke or somehow created these living things that now exist. Now, what that means, I'm not quite sure. But it's like it's a puzzle where we've got these certain things. The Harlequin, where belief and reality overlap, we're not quite sure. The Harlequins believe in the idea of Kegarak and the Laughing God saving their souls from Slaanesh on a whim, some of them, which I've kind of, just essentially means that there's this fickle. Is there really an entity within the warp and the webway called Kegarak, or is that just a manifestation, an embodiment of the idea that actually the curse of Slaanesh is not universal, that certain Eldar are free of its taint and will survive? And then that kind of then spins into the Ynnari thing and the idea of being able to be freed of the taint, and actually the Whispering God will essentially absorb that curse for you and absolve you of that curse and things. So
a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and particularly because the Eldar are so much about their cycles, the fact that death, birth, death, rebirth sort of thing, which is again, it's kind of been lost a little bit along the way, but the Ynnari have kind of brought it back to the fore with the idea that the Eldar always believed their souls were reborn into new bodies. And again, going back to the sort of like the original metaphysics, the idea that every living being, or at least every sentient being, had a flame or reflection in the warp. And, as I say, for humans, it's a brief candle snuff that just goes and is absorbed. For psychers, it's a powerful flame. For the Aeldari, it seems to be a physical thing that can exist beyond the death of its mortal shell and then be reattached to another mortal shell. We see this in the Phoenix Lords, we see it in the Ynnari and things, this idea that the Aeldari soul is not the same. I've hung kind of, again, in Wild Rider, sort of examined this idea that maybe that's really the bit that was created by the old ones, was this permanent soul that did not dissipate into the warp. The problem being that loads of these souls ended up sticking together and creating Slaanesh. Yeah, once you start digging into it and scratching it, you're like,
It's a little bit deep than first thought,
Starts getting really quite deep. So at the moment, there seems to be a bit of speculation between, there are actually two wars in the heavens. So you've got the one between the Necrons and the Eldar and the old ones. So the old ones create the Eldar to fight the Necrons and the shards, and all that happen.
Yeah.
And then obviously over like 60 million years, the Eldar go through this massive boom of population and like cultural explosion. And then there's a second war in heaven, which is between the gods and Cain slaughtering everyone.
Yeah.
And having a big fight that is. And so that's actually really interesting. So before the fall occurred, there seems to be a bit of thought. So were the Eldar, did they reincarnate?
That seems to be the established idea, yes, that the Eldari, and that's the thing, that's the key of the Ynnari, is this idea of the difference between the Eldar, the Craftworld Eldar, the Drukhari, and the idea of the Aeldari as a single unified species who had all of these different abilities, and the main one being the ability to reincarnate. Basically, their souls were. If you think that what happened when Slaanesh was created was that rather than those souls being born again into new bodies by whatever mystical, metaphysical process that works, we don't know really, they're instead being absorbed by Slaanesh, which of course is horrifying. So you end up with a place where the Drukhari are essentially just feeding their souls all the time, so they never quite die. And then you've got the Aeldari, the Asuriani, essentially are sticking them away in these little glass bottles and powering their craftworlds off the dead. But again, they're never being released into the warp. So they're not being absorbed by Slaanesh, but there's also no chance of them reincarnating into new bodies. And that was kind of part of the whole diminishing species, I suppose, is not just like numbers, but the idea that this ability, they can no longer sustain themselves. That perhaps even there was a finite number of souls that were created for the Eldar back when, and everyone that's lost cannot be reborn. And that's one of the reasons why there's so few Eldar children and things as well. Is like new souls aren't necessarily created, or something like that potentially.
Yeah, they don't have new souls. That's actually really, really fascinating.
Well, the souls is a big important thing. It's one of the things I did with the Harlequins and the idea of the solitaire being soulless and what's something really strange going on there, and the separation of the body, the physical form of an Eldari, and their soul, and the connection in between. Because Spirit Stones powering Wraith Lords and Wraith Knights, and is there something? Again, we have not really gone into it, but is there something particularly about the Wraith Knights are piloted by twins, and the Titans we know are piloted by triplets, and that's a very powerful image of actually perhaps potentially three bodies sharing one soul. Maybe
being interconnected to be one.
So that this kind of super soul that connects three of them together.
Because how rare that is, just in like Eldar culture, like a birth alone is rare, but twins rarer, and then triplets, my God, rarer still, like one in a million.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in Path of the Outcast, there was a character whose name I can't remember now, but who was a powerful Eldar Psyker, but rather than and he set up this sort of it's basically Webway Mos Eisley again. There's a version of Mos Eisley in all my pretty much, but a place between the craft worlds and Kamara and everywhere else, like an example of many of these kind of little pocket universes. But in order to keep running it, essentially he splits bits of himself off, and it creates these autonomous parts of himself. So there's actually about there's like 30 or 40 of him now, each with a bit of his soul in it, in these artificial kind of wraithbone constructs. And each one, so each a part of the whole, but also entirely independent as well. And I like this idea that's kind of the key of the Eldar psychic engineering, is this ability that their physical form and their soul are detachable and movable, and there's It's things that literally humans could never do. Their souls, just even the psychos, are just never powerful enough, never coherent enough. As soon as that break between their physical form and their soul happens, death usually, but it could be something else, then that soul starts to erode and dissipate and whatever else. And if that just doesn't happen with the Eldar, which allows them to have psychic technology like craft worlds, and that was the big thing. You know, again, a lot of this technology, especially, it wasn't invented after the fall. It may have been honed or changed or adapted to their needs, but actually, all this psychic technology existed for 60 million years. You know.
Because the fall was pretty recent in Eldar history. Well,
absolutely,
I mean,
that was yesterday.
Yeah.
You know, it's at best 5 generations ago.
Okay.
You know, I think, and depending on how long we say Eldar live, which is all a bit vague as well. But you know, I kind of put it, the average age of an Eldar is at least 2,000 years. So
pretty significant. But then there are Eldar that have exponentially longer lives as well, like Eldrad himself, which was pushing like the 11,000, 12,000 year mark.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that goes back to this idea that perhaps it's when you start looking at sort of like the origins of the Eldar, you know, in terms of the real world and you know, their elves in space, and one of the biggest influence of that, as well as folklore, is obviously the Tolkien elves and the idea that they never died but wearied of life and would go away. So although there's no concrete thing that's said about how, you know, how Eldar die, you can imagine that pretty much most of them, you know, it's always those big questions about immortality. You know, Eldrad has sustained himself for so long because he has this idea. He will never let himself die, but he's slowly turned to crystal. You know, just like the seers do. That's part of that price of that very powerful, strong, psychic soul, is the drain it eventually takes on the body. But I imagine kind of like a sort of a lesser effect, I suppose, for normal Eldar is that they're pretty much, you know, they take quite a long time to reach maturity, but then they're adults for a long, long time. But then the end comes swiftly. And you imagine if they were originally able to reincarnate, you know, nobody wants to be lugging around an old bad body for very long. So what would probably normally happen would be, you know, once that very honed alien body does start to deteriorate, then the soul would separate and a new one would be created somehow. Which is similar to obviously some of the Drukhari practices. So again, this is where the underpinnings are strong, but so actually it's just iterated in different ways. This idea of creating clone bodies and things like that.
Yeah, because the Drukhari have clones.
Yeah. And the idea of Pureborn and stuff like that, which wasn't necessarily intended when all of this stuff was written in White Dwarf 127 and the second edition codex and stuff, but actually the iterations of it just make sense. Of Lego, well, once you establish these few things about what being a psychic race is and how this all kind of works, and then the possibilities of what that might actually mean, all suddenly seem to tie together. Yeah.
Because I think one of the things I read that there's no psychers in Dark Eldar, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have like latent psychic abilities. They just, is that true? They just don't like practicing at all.
Because if
or
they
is that
did,
kind of be bred out of them?
Yeah, so if they did, they'd be opening themselves up to Slanesh, is that right? And then that would be
I think that was one of the, I mean, one of the, there's kind of two things there. One, I suspect, that psychic potential, they don't have that because you are still essentially tapping into the power of the warp, even as an Eldar. You know, Eldrad and the Farseers use the system of runes to act as kind of like gateways and barriers between them and the raw warp, which the Drukhari don't have. And I suspect a part of it's kind of cultural as well, just that idea that there was probably a purge of the most psychically potent members of the society shortly after the fall, perhaps blamed for the fall, even the ones that survived, and can kind of continued proximity by not fleeing from the Eye of Terror, but actually building a city in the Webway near it, would have weaned out the most psychic individuals. But it's one of those where I think with the craft worlds, one of the things I've kind of said is there's this, they have this psychic connection, which isn't like telepathy and things, but they are interconnected with each other and via the infinity circuit. And the Drukhari just don't have that. Essentially, it's a muscle that's atrophied. It's there, like I say, they could probably train. You know, when they become a Ynnari, when the Drukhari kind of like accept the Whispering God into their lives, or whatever it is they do, they have ability, they tap into the idea of the Whisper, this psychic field, this gestalt that the Ynnari share with each other, and which they're able to tap into, but actually I've kind of described because they're empty inside, because their souls are always feeding off, they're essentially a little black hole in the warp in a way, because they're always siphoning off energy now instead. The Craftworld Eldar find them sort of a bit like a void, a bit cold, not full on null, sort of like terrifying and horrifying, but actually they're just a bit empty. The Drukhari, they don't get, because they haven't got that instant psychic empathy with each other. When a Craftworld Eldar or an outcast potentially with a spirit they meet to Drukhari, they just don't get that sense of connection that they would get with another Craftworld Eldar. So it's just like when meeting somebody, when they give off bad vibes, their body language is a bit odd or whatever. You don't know what it is, but they're just not.
You just don't feel comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a cause for? Is that a cause for friction? Just moving forward with the narrative of building the identity of the Ynnari, like you've got Drukhari, you've got Eldar, you've got probably Corsairs coming in. As you were saying before, if you were able to get your hands on them, Exodites, even like the Harlequins jumping in. So you've got like this whole mixed bag who've had all this time to drift apart, to separate, to become their own creatures. So like fighting as a Ynnari force, would you have problems with like a Drukhari squad and an Eldar force, or would they be mixed? Would they have problems taking orders from one another, or is the overriding idea of being Ynnari enough to like reestablish them as a solidified people?
Well, thanks for asking, because that's pretty much what I look at. That's the sort of the journey that Aeldari goes on in Wild Rider as a new craft welder who's essentially paired with.
Good segue, Todd.
Yeah. Good question. Awesome question. Read the book.
Well, the answer is yes. There is that initial cultural and kind of psychic dissonance between them, and Aeldari has all kinds of assumptions about the Drukhari, because it's never. The difference with Aeldari is actually he used to have in the part of the Outcast book, we know that he had a Drukhari lover, or that she was fleeing Kamara as well, actually. But he spent time with Drukhari actually, so he's already got all sorts of assumptions. But yeah, but longer term, being Ynnari overcomes this, I suppose. But if we look at all their differences are essentially because of the different survival traits they've developed. Then once you replace those survival traits with being connected to the Whispering God, being connected to Iliad, and essentially the underlying tenet there is that when you die, the Whispering God will take your soul and eventually will reincarnate you as it was meant to be back in the good old days. That's the underlying acceptance of becoming an Ynnari, is that it's okay to die, which is obviously utterly opposite of almost all other. It's okay to die and let your soul go. Don't try and trap it. Don't try and keep feeding it. Don't do any of that other stuff that everyone's trying to do post-fall. Actually, the Ynnari is about accepting it, and actually, and when Iliad is powerful enough that they will be reincarnated as they were when they were first created. So once you accept that, once you accept the Whispering God into your life, as it were, those fears and those hang-ups and all that cultural stuff that has kind of appended off those survival strategies disappears, which would be interesting. I mean, which is why developing the Ynnari as an army and going forward, without having a single clue what they intend to do. But it's one of those, because it's a different survival strategy. So you'd think, although it started off, it's got troops from the other armies in it to make it practical, that you're collecting aspect warriors and guardians and Kabbalites and witches and that kind of stuff. Over a period of time, with those distinctions, as much as those distinctions are already created for gameplay, but actually those cultures that they come from start to be unimportant within the Ynnari, and you'd hopefully see some distinct Ynnari troop types that maybe mirror those in some way, but are actually something in and of themselves. It's a bit of an odd one because it's where you start taking very literal game stuff and putting it into a background in a very obvious way. It's where you start seeing where game background can creak sometimes. Well, what defines a witch? Well, actually in Camorra, there's all this kind of cult in the arenas and these ritualized weapons and stuff. But once you remove the witch from that culture, are they still a witch? What parts do they give up? What, you know, or similarly with an aspect warrior, let's say, how does that actually translate into the Ynnari? And I'm not sure what the answers are, or whether, you know, they'll just be avoided and it will just be, you know, it's always a bit tricky releasing armies that are bits of other armies in terms of a range and miniatures and stuff like that, because it's always a bit, you know, there's not necessarily as much of a focus. So, and it'll come down to, well, let's be honest, it'll come down to Des Goodwin, whether he's got some awesome ideas for particular troop types and characters that will, you know, form the core of an Ynnari army, or there might always ever just be an appendix sort of idea that never quite get a codex. But that, you know, we'll see. We'll know, you know.
It sure is interesting times though with the armies that come out. So who knows? Yeah.
Well, I'd love to see it actually. I think it was sort of reading the original Gathering Storm background, but then sort of working with it was you know, lots of people seem to think it was like, oh well, you know, the Eldar have lost their thing. You know, it's a bit like the Return of Gilliman and stuff. Oh yeah, it's all shiny now. No, it really isn't. It's just everything was as broken as before. There's just more broken people around. And the Ynnari as an idea of this somehow saving the Eldar is a long concept, you know. It's such a will never be realised in our lifetime sort of thing that all it's done really, I think, is just brought up these really interesting ideas that we can then allow us to explore some of this stuff in a different way. You know, like I said, I don't see Ivrain finding the last Crone Sword anytime soon and rescuing the entirety of the Eldar race, or them all dying horribly. In the same way that Ranadandra was never going to happen. You know, these are narratives that we'll never see the end of, really. But what we can do is use them to explore ideas along the way. And the Ynnari have introduced a whole bunch of new ideas, I think, into the Eldar and shaking it up a bit in ways that, you know, again, because it kind of crosses the codexes in a way, it's very much background that's outside, you know. As much as you can collect an Ynnari army, actually, it's about the background evolving beyond just the armies on the tabletop and into these metaphysical areas and stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you foresee? Oh, sorry, Brendan, you go.
So with basically the Eldar recollecting the forces and trying to become a whole collective once again, were there any Eldar craft worlds that actually ventured beyond the known galaxy that we may see? So maybe some Eldar that fled before the peril, or maybe even ones that went out exploring before the Second War in Heaven. I mean,
well, yeah, I mean that's one of the that's an interesting question, really, isn't it? Because the original craft worlds were these, you know, huge trading vessels that were sent out, and then the craft worlds, as we understand them, fled just before the fall to try and get as far away as possible. So there's different things there. I mean, one of the that's kind of slightly one of the concepts in the first book, Ghost Warrior, this craft world Zaya Suthra, which was basically went off. You know, nobody quite sure where it went, but it basically disappeared just after the fall and returns 10,000 years later. Nobody's quite sure why it went, or particularly why it came back, but it's very clear that it went before the path reached them. You know, that's one of the things, again, that once you recognise that the craft worlds, as we understand them, didn't spring into being fully formed, then actually craft worlds that the Phoenix Laws never reached, craft worlds that the idea of far-seeing never got to, would be really different. There'd be just something. The first question is whether they'd be able to survive at all or not. There must be loads of them drifting out there that without that discipline, without these kind of new takes on how to deal with Slaanesh, eventually succumbed, would have died out. Some of them might be corrupted, you know, it would be cool.
Chaos Eldar.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Chaos Eldar one's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's always been there. There was always the line in the old codex about the Eldar that burned with the dark light of chaos. In fact, I think it was originally for Ara, but Father Scorpions and burnt the dark light of chaos. But the same with the elves in Warhammer. So once you start getting into you get into a slightly different place with the Aeldari, I suppose, because they're innately corrupted. So in Jane Zara, I think it is, I hinted at, well, not even hinted at, they in sort of like post-fall, when she's off with Asherman trying to find other survivors, they run across a culture which has this kind of, they've got these weird stones that they kind of communicate with, they have implanted in their heads, and they call this kind of hive mind idea, these Aeldari in this little pocket universe. But they slowly realise that actually they're kind of enslaved to some other power. And I think, you know, that's one of the things you can look at. There's different ways of basically being Chaos Eldar, and I don't see, you know, I could almost see them not being Slaneshi Eldar, but actually being trying to bargain their souls to the other gods
to try and escape the punishment.
Would be quite interesting.
And they wouldn't have any of the specialists. There wouldn't be any striking scorpions. There wouldn't be any.
Well, no, absolutely.
Any other stuff
all of that
either.
stuff came out of the, you know, it came out of the path, and the path isn't just like fighting. It was that whole idea of basically partitioning their brains and their spirits in such a way that they deal with their extremes of emotion one bit at a time. You know, so although Asherman, the kind of like warlike self-destructive tendency was the bit that Asherman was focused on initially, the idea of this spreading into other emotions and other destructive tendencies, I suppose, is what created it's what marks out the craft world. It's why they are the Ashuriani. They follow the Ashuriani path of essentially self-denial, not quite as strict as the Exodites in the way they think, but you know, so without that, you have to think, well, all kinds of cults and other different survival mechanisms. If a craft world survived 10,000 years without the path, what other things might it have done? And Zarathustra is an example of that, of how a craft world encountered something else, which was up to the task of resisting the incursions of chaos, really. Although when they first encounter Zarathustra, they're very wary because they think potentially that there is an outside, maybe chaotic influence on the craft world. So, but chaos is essentially always destructive. So even if a craft world kind of embraced chaos in some fashion, again,
it wouldn't survive that 10,000
years and not succumb to its own predatory needs or demons or any of that other stuff would be difficult, but be cool. I mean, it's kind of a thought experiment, but it's the sort of thought experiments that particularly, you know, you get to explore in novels. Of like, you throw that what if up there, you know, what if a craft world, you know, didn't quite escape Slanesh, but so decided to throw themselves on the mercy of Nurgle. How would that manifest? You know, what would be different about it? What would they need to do for them to survive 10,000 years or whatever? And then kind of think through those themes.
Well, you'd have like a Zinch Eldar. That would be,
well, yes, yeah. Well,
tap into that psychic ability.
Well, that's absolutely. I mean, and then you have to kind of get to the essence of it, because a lot of the portrayal of the chaos stuff, and particularly visuals and things, is very much based on the human ideas, obviously. So the Nurgle idea of decay and death would be very different to an Eldar idea. Their bodies and their souls being very different, and what they're fearful of, their fears of death would manifest differently, perhaps. And similarly, and also there's just the question of whether they'd already done this, which is why they had Cain and why they had Isha, and why they had, you know, had they found another way to come to terms with their psychic strength and create their own versions of these powers in the warp to protect them against these great powers. And then obviously they created one themselves, which they weren't able to defend against. So, and then people are asking about whether Isha, you know, is in a cage in Nurgle's realm, and what's reality and what's metaphor, and what's a myth on one particular craft world. Is that a reality? You know, or somebody was asking if, you know, would a craft world or would the Ynnari launch a mission to try and rescue Isha? And it was like, well, if we're proceeding from the basis of that one craft world, one myth, about Isha is true, then actually we go, oh, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? But what does that actually mean? Because all of these things, the mansion of Nurgle and Isha herself are metaphors for weird, warpy, swarmy stuff, swirly things, and all this kind of stuff that only manifests when mortals interpret it. So, but on
she's the
other hand,
god of
Ynnari
life,
actually has
isn't she?
gone through the Garden of Nurgle physically herself on a mission before, so it can be done.
Isha is the god of life, isn't she? For the Eldar?
Sorry, what was that?
What was Isha's role again? She was the goddess of...
Well, she's the mother goddess, really.
Mother goddess, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the life giver.
Yeah, the life giver, the mother of the, but she was the yeah. So it's supposedly it's the spirit stones or the tears of Isha that she shed when the fall happened, or I like to think of it, or are they what's left? I mean, I kind of introduced some stuff like in the Aushammer Phoenix Lord novel, actually, which was sort of like where there was an Eldar at the time of the fall, there was then a spirit stone. Essentially, they were turned into spirit stones, these empty kind of crystalline husks that could then be inhabited by a soul. Well, I like the idea that actually, and that kind of ties into this idea of the separation of the physical and the soul. So the soul was consumed by Slanesh, and the physical was turned into this empty vessel waiting for the soul. But whether that was actually, is Isha a metaphor for this mechanism of incarnating souls into physical vessels, or was she a literal creator, old one, or anything else in between?
Yeah,
sentient virus. Who knows?
Yeah, was she a weapon created by the Eldar initially? The ancient Eldar.
Yeah.
So crazy. I mean, I love it.
And or something variations thereof, or all of these things, because as we said, actually there have been over 60 million years. There have been 20 Ishas in various roles that have created and recreated the Eldar. Would Yvraine be remembered as Ishar in another 30,000 years? 100,000 years. Would she be the new Isha for the rebirth of the Eldar?
Because they had 60 million years to develop technology, and there was a piece of technology that was found by an Imperial explorator fleet, which literally allowed, like, the Eldar had created, and what it did, it willed whatever a person thought about into existence, like entire cities, armies, whatever. It all happened. Anyway, they destroyed it because it was corrupted by chaos. But 60 million years of technological advancements. Think how far we've come as a species in just 200. Imagine how much further all these things would have.
Absolutely. It's one of the things I love. One of the authors I really like, has been very influential for me over the years, is Ian M. Banks. He wrote unfortunately dead now, but wrote the Culture series, which again is this very ultra tech society. It's like technology is magic almost and that sort of thing. But actually, I like to kind of dip into lots of the stuff that he did there in terms of manipulation of matter and energy, and it all being second nature, really. The Eldar have lost a lot in the fall, actually, because of course that's the theme of 40k quite a bit as well. But actually, when I write quotes like "the stars used to live and die at our command," you go, that's not exaggeration. They had the technologies to create stars, to destroy stars, to do these things, and actually do it on a fairly everyday basis. And it was that sheer power and comfort which is what corrupted them. But yeah, that technology, and obviously in 40k technology being psychic technology, we get to literally blur the lines between magic and science.
Because you start going down a rabbit hole, because the whole thought of Eldar birthing Slanesh through their actions, but then you've got 3 other Chaos gods who have potentially been around for an infinite, whether time has meaning or not. What other Chaos gods or what other entities exist, because you've got that whole underlying theme of belief making reality within the warp.
Yeah.
So gods and monsters out there for 60 million years.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And one of the one of the underlying metaphysics of it is the idea of the warp, and actually as I understand it, so 60 million years ago ish and thereabouts, when a lot of this prehistory stuff was kicking off, the warp was pretty much flat, and actually potentially the old ones created the Webway, in my version anyway, and the Eldar inherited it basically, and I've got all kinds of stuff about how they did it, but in my head, but essentially that kind of burrowing through the warp started the ripples in some ways. You know, that started the first of the disturbances, which then started, you know, soul matter and ideas and things started to be able to coalesce, and that's essentially how later on, especially when humanity was born, it's supposed to be like the big, you know, when humans start killing each other and particularly exploding across the galaxy, is when you've got these massive turmoil across the warp, and which essentially ends up turning into the warp storms that create, you know, the age of strife. But that was a long time coming. You know, it's one of those. It's like when you talk about technology. You know, when you see the progress of certain, you know, like human population on the Earth, it's like it's almost flat until it's sort of like the Industrial Revolution, and then it just spikes, and here we are 200 years later with, you know, coming up to 8 billion people on the planet, and it's that on the galactic scale. You know, you got 60 million years of not much, and then in the last 200,000 years, suddenly, boom, loads of activity. This really weird, brash race turns up, and chaos powers and all that kind of stuff. And of course, like I say, as soon as, because there is that kind of weird effect with time in the warp, as soon as something's created, then it was always there. So, you know, that gives us all kinds of weird stuff to play around with. So the idea of the Eldar creating Slanesh, but actually Slanesh also goading the Eldar into creating it.
I can't imagine how shocked the Eldar would be at just like the human race just suddenly appearing out of nowhere in like 10,000.
Who the hell are these guys? Like, where'd they come from? Like,
yeah.
Were these monkeys?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was always a bit. Jez always liked to say, actually, there was a bit of a thing that the Eldar with that sort of like their slightly pointy heads and their almond-shaped eyes are actually greys that are visiting us, and that's how we remember them.
Hey man, works for me.
So they are among us.
They're
I'm
among
surprised
us.
they let us live. But it's kind of like, if the old ones create humans, you could almost imagine that there was a little bit of a "do not interfere" quarantine sign put up somewhere or whatever. Though, because I can't imagine the old. You know, as soon as humanity started expanding, if humanity was that disruptive, but you know, part of that was maybe the Eldar's laxity. You know, again, if they're masters of the galaxy in whatever frame of reference they want to use, then actually the threat of chaos being vastly underestimated at the time, you know. And then suddenly it's too late. This very short-lived, very brash race suddenly, like I say, over a period of essentially a few generations, as far as the Elder are concerned, you know.
Yeah, they turned up yesterday and they're already annoying.
You know, they literally remember. I remember when none of these stars were populated, and suddenly there's 50 human planets now sprung up, and disturbing the warp everywhere, and bits of the Webway are breaking now, and it's all gone a bit wrong. You can imagine them not being very quick to react, actually.
Speaking of the Webway, Scotty, did you ask your Webway question? You were like harping on about it.
No, I haven't yet. So I was listening to, like I said, we've been listening to a few podcasts in lore and stuff, and one came up that I particularly liked was, and I'll put a situation to you. You have Craftworld 1 and Craftworld 2 within, you know, 1 light year of each other, or whatever specified distance is. Is there a time, or is it possible that it would be quicker to go from one craft world to another craft world in real space than to go from one craft world to the other craft world via the Webway? Because
it would be unlikely. I think they'd have to be in such close physical proximity to each other, because we don't know if I don't think that even the Eldar have got fast and light physical travel.
Yeah.
So, as much as they could, they possibly have stuff that could approach the speed of light, you're still, you're still talking about quite long times And the distance so short within the Webway, you know, jumping 1 light year in the Webway is a step as far as they're concerned.
Right. Yeah.
Really. So I think, so that's sort of that get out clause really of being able to travel faster than light through the Webway would ultimately always make it slightly quicker, because the difference being is whether there's, you know, the limiting factor is whether there is a connection, a stable connection. Or, you know, we sort of introduced the idea that they can burrow new Webway portals over a short distance and for a limited amount of time, because otherwise it doesn't make sense at all. But and also the size of the Webway, the thing you're trying to get through, you know, and the distances. So, but I think, you know, just relativity and all the rest of it. By the time I think you'd got a ship fast enough up to a speed that it could kind of travel those sorts of distances, I think the hand wavium of the Webway would kick in first and make it quicker.
It's just quicker because I said so.
Yeah, there's a bit in with the Azrael novel, he ends up with the Eldar in the Webway, and obviously it's very strange for him because of course they're actually walking up. They're going to attack a chaos ship in orbit, and they're walking there. But he asks how long it's going to take them, and the warlock that's leading them basically just says to him, says, "Well, will it make it shorter if you know? You know, it's like it will take as long as it takes. You know, your knowledge of this will not change how far you have to travel, sort of thing." And I guess that's their concept of it as well, of the Webway, is like we have to kind of assume that unlike the warp, there is a certain I don't know. The Webway's been portrayed in some different ways, really. But I suppose in the same way that the warp works quite differently, in that a ship surrounds itself with a bubble reality and kind of bobbles along on these currents and navigates from current to current to get to where it's going to do. And its engines are mostly used to break a hole into and out of the warp. It doesn't really power it through the warp very much, although it can be done. Whereas the Webway, we talk very much about ships navigating the Webway more like a physical space.
Yeah,
and actually, obviously some things are faster than others somehow.
Yeah.
And that kind of runs, and the way I've portrayed that in the past is it runs off essentially. The Webway itself is a power source. You know, it's psychic in its own nature, so you can tap into it. But also, if you've got your own sort of psychic engines on board, so it'd be spirit stones for the craft of Eldar, are kind of the Drukhari ships are powered by torture.
Torture.
Yeah, well, you can hear them screaming through the Webway as they approach. You know, because the Drukhari don't have their own innate, like as we were saying earlier, you know, don't have their innate psychic power to kind of tap into the Webway matrix in a way. What they do is they have to create this psychic energy through the torture and pain and all the other stuff that they usually feed on, and use that to establish the interface. So, which I think is just a cool image of like, just, you know, there's this,
it's like
again, extending that established background into how do they use the Webway. If the Webway's psychic and they don't have psychics, it's like, well, they just do it more of the way they do it. They just use everybody else's, they just torture everybody else's souls to a nice fine pitch and use that to connect to the Webway.
I'm not torturing you enough. Sing, damn you.
Well, that's it, yeah. I can imagine, you know. But in the same way that Andy Hoare, I think in his, I think it's Rogue, I can't remember, Rogue Star, one of his Rogue Trader novels, there's a great bit of them essentially putting the battery in the warp drive of a ship, or the warp engine of a ship, which essentially is an insane psyker in a box. You know, like that
that's a Duracell and a half.
Well, how else would you power Gellerfield except with a trapped psyker or psychers? You know, there's no other way to generate. You can't artificially generate a psychic field. So, the Webway is a bit more of a tamer version of that, I suppose, in that the energy of the ship married to the energy of the Webway kind of determines how fast it can travel, and obviously the spaces it can travel through. There's a couple of, I think, might be part of the Outcast, is a Webway chase scene where there's Drukhari chasing after the main character, and it's gaining on them, and they do. I can't remember what they do now, but they break out of the Webway in some kind of weird, spectacular fashion, which the Drukhari can't follow because they don't have their own cycles, sort of thing. So, and it's kind of cool. It's just this ever, I just kind of see this sort of. I can just see all these eternally kind of floating tunnels, and some of them these weird architects, and some of them just amorphous.
That's what I sort of assumed was like, every point is the same point in. From what I understand, every craft world is the same point in the Webway. Doesn't matter where, but the ships can move. So within real space they can move closer, but they're still the same distance away. And if it's like from one end of the Webway to the other.
Oh right, I see what you mean.
That's sort of where that concept has come from.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, okay. Well, yeah. I mean, if it did work like that, that would be more understandable. If there was still, like say, 60,000 years of equivalent of Webway in between. I mean, for me, the Webway is a constantly moving thing. It's a network, but actually, it's got enough physics because it's half warp and half physical that actually it's adjusting. So that web route, if you think of the Webway portals in a way as kind of like the terminuses, but actually the Webway is kind of almost iterative. It's created between those points at any given moment of where they are.
Okay.
And essentially they're a psychic network. And it's through the power of the Webway, or what Eldrad called the Eternal Matrix, which was actually sort of like this meta infinity circuit between the craft worlds, which allows them to kind of communicate. It's not just a transportation system, it's a psychic communication system and everything else as well. So so because it's got those warp properties, I suppose, that it's able to expand and collapse as required, depending on where the portals actually are in relation to each other in real space.
And buried at the heart of it is the Black Library.
Somewhere. Well, in lots of places, actually.
Well, speaking of locations, so in the physical location of the universe, where is the Uthray shipyards? They've got someone asking me. It's like, I need to know where they're located.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what's the reference from?
So someone was asking, so there was like I've just got a message here from my friends. He wants to know where the shipyard's located because there's a reference that says it's not in the Webway, because the Uthray craft world itself is quite close to the Eye of Terror.
That's right, yeah.
But the shipyards for the Uthray craft world are actually positioned much, much further away. And someone's saying, are they within the Webway themselves, or are they actually situated on like the other side of the galaxy, like near the end of the galaxy?
Right. Okay. I don't know, because I mean that's something I didn't create, if you see me. So I'm not sure if there was anything else intended, or whether it just sounded cool that their ships aren't quite close. I mean, so I'm not sure what the context was for saying that about Uthray, for seeing as a piece of background. I wouldn't imagine they were too far away, because I guess the idea is we've always talked about the craft world essentially kind of skimming the very outskirts of the Eye of Terror and kind of looking inside and using the energies and stuff. And so the shipyards being far enough away that they're not within the actual Eye of Terror itself, but probably close enough that there's no point having a shipyard on the other side of the galaxy if it takes even through the Webway, if it takes you ages for the ship to get back to your craft world, or more importantly for you to go and defend it should it be attacked. But I've always generally kind of seen Eldar shipyards as a physical place. There'll be a connection to the Webway, but actually the craft elves all have a big Webway portal that follows them around behind, which is how the ships physically move from the craft world into the Webway. So I think they'll get built in real space. But that said, Uthray, they're clever. They could even have a little bit of a pocket universe that's kind of dragged around with them, like I say, if it moves, so it's always a sensible distance away. But actually, as the craft world drifts through the outskirts of the Eye of Terror, the position of the the shipyard within the Webway would move with them, which would make some sense rather than a physical location which they'd get closer or further away from.
Sneaky Eldar.
Yes. Well, I like there was a bit that back in the original Battlefleet Gothic background about the Planet Killer ship, and the Planet Killer was only buildable in the warp. That you couldn't physically have built it in real space because of its kind of internal weird dimensions and its power and stuff like that. So there could be all three. Have they got a little Webway ship barrage because they're trying to concoct something that can never be built normally for exclusive use within the Webway or something like that? You can never trust
like a new Vol Black Star Fortress.
Yeah.
Well, look out.
Or something that can shoot into the Eye of Terror. Who knows?
They were Eldar weapons, weren't they? Or sorry, pre Eldar, back to the ye old days.
Yeah, the whole Black. I mean, again, this is something I'm not massively across in terms of the development of it because it's this whole kind of Blackstone idea, and it's obviously being taken forward. This idea of this material. I mean, it was very, when we originally did Battlefleet Gothic, they were pre-imperial, not human weapons, and there was obviously something between them, that allowed them to combine their powers together when they were, when there was more of them in the vicinity. And then sort of like there was in the Eye of Terror, they then kind of got the moniker of the Talismans of Gaul, and this idea that maybe they were something more connected with the War in Heaven and that side of stuff, and I think the information now, again, not necessarily. Because there's information now that's linked to that Necrontyr technology, but something slightly different to the pylon technology they use. And I think the idea of it, it's like, it can be positive or negative, either a null or a booster or something like that. But again, it's not something I've read the details of, and I've only had very passing conversations about it. But it all sounds very exciting and something to be exploited at some point. But we'll hint at, I suppose, again, as kind of I don't know whether it's directly connected to the resurgence of the Necrons or anything like that, or whether the idea really was that the Blackstones were this kind of Lovecraftian objects in space, that mankind couldn't really understand, but they just bolted loads of gun batteries to them and lived inside them because mankind is arrogant like that. And then suddenly, and you have to remember at the time when we were writing Battlefleet Gothic as well, is one of the big influences on us was, Babylon 5 was going really strong. And lots of shadow technology and the Mechanicus and all that sort of stuff fed their ideas into it. So the idea of a Blackstone fortress basically shedding and shocking off the Imperial entrapments and bits on it and essentially going live itself was a cool image, crackling with energy, and we could see the CGI. It's like as this kind of as this thing kind of awoke, as it were. So there's elements of that, and also in the Aushammer novel, as kind of a nod to that, slight indicating things beyond the knowledge of man. The whole plot of Aushammer kind of revolves around humans awakening. I think it was called an obliterator shard or something. This immensely powerful weapon, which itself was only a tiny bit of something that was far vaster that the Eldar had to destroy way back in the mists of time. And they couldn't destroy it completely, but they could just break it apart. But even activating one shard of this was, and there was supposed to be 3 of these shards got activated or something, which was, again, and not literally the Blackstone fortresses, but perhaps a similar technology. This was very much a chaos. It was something that had been created by an Eldar, an older race using chaos power. It was very much a chaos monolith type thing. But so yeah, the galaxy being seeded with all these kind of 60 million years of weird technologies and races that came and went and died, and we no longer understand, and they left souvenirs all over the place. There was always on one of the old maps from 2nd edition onwards, there was always the Imgar monolith, which was just something that was, I can't even remember who made up the name, or it was just something that was put on the map as something interesting. But that always kind of sparked these ideas of just a bit like the original Rogue Trader Warp Gates ideas, that the galaxy actually is. There's loads of these ancient, mysterious stuff out there, which kind of hint towards this long, long history, most of which are deadly. You don't, but mankind particularly will just go, hey, the depths of mechanical.
Let's have a go at this
in
one.
an arc and start drilling holes in it and seeing what's what, bolting a few mechadendrites to it and trying to use it.
That's the spirit.
Yeah, we will tame it. We will tame the Xenos tech. We're all dead.
Yeah.
Oh, everyone said, "Oh no, we unleashed chaos again."
Well,
bad.
Oh, damn.
Just virus bomb.
Just
And-
exterminatus.
Try again.
Oh, man. I've had another question come through. How big? So I don't know. Let's use a Death Star for scale. On a scale of Millennium Falcon to Death Star, how big is a craft world? Let's say we'll go back to how big is like Bella Tank craft world, because that's quite healthy.
Not anymore. It's not.
Well, yes, about half the size it used to be.
Yeah, that's half as big as it was.
My sort of go-to is that craft world. Most craft worlds these days, of any significant size, are at least continent-sized, whatever that means on Death Star. So they have various landscapes. They have a climate. They are big enough that you can go from mountains to desert. They have, but not necessarily in one contiguous mass, but in terms of across the various domes and things like that. And the major ones are at least, they're a lot flatter than a planet. So mass-wise, they're not necessarily anywhere near a planet or even necessarily moon. But actually, they can take, even for Eldar technology, they take a considerable amount of time to cross. When we talk about armies invading a craft world, one of the major craft worlds in Path of the Outcast, the Imperium or Imperial Force ends up attacking the Light-Up craft world. And it's a campaign. It's like it's probably hundreds of miles for tanks driving across these landscapes and doing all the, and Titans striding, mountain valleys and all that kind of stuff. They're big enough to be cool for their battles.
I always got the feeling reading.
They're called craft worlds for a reason, I suppose.
Yeah, they're not a craft city.
But so the smallest ones, again, are sufficient. But bearing in mind, in the same way that most of our continents are, relatively speaking, sparsely populated compared to, say, an imperial hive, where you've got billions of people in a very small space. So although they're rather large, the Eldar are kind of clustered in quite small settlements across it. They'll have cities, they'll have towns and things, but it's not like it's wall to wall. It's not Australia filled with, an Eldar every 2 meters. It's, it's kind of like you guys are now. You've got massive wildernesses in between these pockets of where everyone hangs out. And the Eldar in particular being because of this psychic empathy, actually, the vast majority of them don't like living too far away from each other. They're quite a social, gregarious race, apart from a few, obviously going on the path of the hermit or the path of the sullen, antisocial guy who will go out, and you need to have some decent wilderness to go out and be on your own with them.
Path of the Dreamer. I think that was in one of your books. That was
the Dreamers. Yeah, exactly. That's sort of like
getting high on shrooms all day,
exploring their subconscious and getting out. Yeah, and experiencing that sort of stuff. So yeah, there may be smaller ones in terms of the original craft worlds. One of the things I think again might have been in James where they approach all three craft worlds, and again this is like 10,000 years ago, so it's still growing. In fact it's being made, and the idea that actually some of the smaller craft worlds flee to the larger craft worlds and end up getting incorporated into it. So what we thought of as a homogeneous craft world is in fact could be 10 or 20 craft worlds that have eventually blended together over the time, just kind of gathering together for survival, basically.
Coexisting just to stay alive, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've got and talks about these kind of crystalline plates which haven't even been grown on yet. And we talked, earlier the idea of the technology they've got to kind of conjure essentially matter replication and things so that they can sculpt the craft worlds in any way they particularly want to, but they have an aesthetic. They want to recreate their homes this is very much one of the things in Wild Rider, actually, again, talking about several of the domes and how the domes and the lands of the clans are sculpted, and the climate and and everything are kind of created to a very specific aesthetic to tell you something about that clan. And so the Firehearts, and they've kind of got this almost permanently autumnal dome, and their towers are kind of incorporated into the hillsides, and these kind of red heather covered hillsides, and the illumination, because the kind of the fortunes of the clan Fireheart are waning and have been, that actually the dome itself is kind of in a permanent twilight to represent this. They're not, the Eldar are such ascetics that they have to represent these things. They have to physically look like they're in decline. They will let parts of their towers fall into decline, even though actually they've got technologies to let them there. So actually you've got these, a bit like the ghost halls in Iandon and things like that, where it's like, well, this stuff's broken and things, but actually there's almost the idea of the form of a thing kind of denoting what it is actually allowing stuff to fall into disrepair, to show that it's in disrepair. You don't just gloss over the surfaces, which is odd, because I see the Eldars individually having quite transient approach to their own appearance, because they can, you can change their pigmentation, they can have whatever hair color they want. We see this extremity with the Drukhari and the kind of body modification and all that kind of stuff. So, which for me stems back from that original idea. If the physical form is just kind of a temporary vessel for the soul, you can do what you like with it, and then it will die and you'll get another one. And you have this kind of almost disposable culture, which they've had to kind of get around now that they don't reincarnate anymore, but there's still an aesthetic choice of like, well, today I'm going to be, I'm just going to change my, rather than dyeing it, physically change their hair color and their eye color, and not necessarily tattoo, but just change the pigmentation of their skin in interesting ways and all that kind of stuff. And
it's very much like a reflection of what's going on internally in their soul.
Yes.
Yeah. Similar, I guess, to how the warp changes, like when the Chaos Space Marines end up in the warp and they start to take on the appearances of like predators and hunters and beasts, because that's the emotions that they're feeling.
Yes. And I think that, that mutability of the physical is very much part of the Eldar, and particularly for the craft worlds, as they're passing from, as their personalities change, as they move from one path to another path and embrace different parts of their personality and things, they'll change their physical appearance to kind of match that. At the start of Path of the Outcast, Aeldari is this very severe figure with kind of short black, sort of like almost barbarically short hair, I think it says, and kind of and very pale goth skin, kind of emo skin and all that, whatever it might be, because that's where he's at that time. But as he becomes an outcast, he's becomes more flamboyant, and he changes into the kind of pirate prince that he wants him to be, and wears his exotic furs and all that kind of stuff. And again, his physical appearance becomes much more exotic with a high crest and all that kind of stuff. Because it's just like, say, it's they'll never, because they're constantly changing in some ways, and they're probably constantly changing their appearance through their lives so that they're in some way representing who they are at any given time.
Well, if they've got a lifespan of such, such a long time, you would need to do that, you would have those changes and different times in a life, you know what I mean? Like everyone knows. So
and I think,
why not somebody thousands of years?
One of the things we've talked about with Jez and that is the idea that, a bit like over the course of art history for us and things, there's various schools and movements and thoughts about aesthetics and ways things, and the Eldar and the different craft worlds have their own ideas of these. So, like, what was cool 3,000 years ago in terms of their aesthetic and their art is different to what it was, generational changes, and a particular artist or creator will come along and do a thing and set a new trend which will last for the next 3 generations, or spread from one craft world, later. So actually, the styles of the statues, the shrines, the design of the domes themselves and their ships and things are all kind of
they would follow that as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, there isn't it's the opposite of the standard template construct idea in a way. It's kind of as much as the miniatures have to have a binding aesthetic, because a falcon looks like a falcon and you want to stick a different bit on it to turn it into a wave set. Actually, you know, the idea of kind of creating stuff for a particular aesthetic, a starship that looks a particular way. You know, this one's going to have butterfly wings. This one looks like a hawk. Well, you know, it's like, oh well, yeah, birds of prey are so last century. You know. So
basically, you've just given us the green light to kit bash however we want.
Absolutely. It's a bit harder with Eldar. This is one of the things I want into because I quite like modelling and stuff, but you know, with orcs and chaos, you can stick spikes on and do bits and depths mechanicus and Imperium and stuff as well. But with the Eldar, they've got an aesthetic. If you just bolt stuff on, you can't just stop. You know, you can't just hammer something into the side of it and make it look cool. You actually have to be quite good at modelling.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to do an Exodite army, but the few I've seen out on the internet just require far too much work to make it close to representing what you want it to.
Yeah,
it's always a lizardman combination. Like you've got your gigantic. There was this really fucking amazing one that was done by this modeler over your way, Gav, in the UK, and I think he actually exhibited it at Warhammer World for a little bit. But it was basically lizardmen, obviously the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And then he had individually molded like weapon housings and brackets, and it was so it was beautiful. It had done what I'd envisioned Exodites to be perfectly. But the amount of skill and the green stuff, it's like he shows you a before and after pic, and you're like, yep, there's a dinosaur, there's maybe like a shuriken and catapult, and then the rest of it was just green stuff. And you're like, holy crap.
Yeah.
Needs a little Questar model.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, so good.
I expect to see a few of the Age of Sigmar, the Idoneth Deepkin and the Daughters of Cain stuff, you know, being translated over into the Aeldari and things like that. I think because, particularly the Idoneth Deepkin, because they're riding big eels and turtles and stuff like that, and they've got these weapons platforms and stuff. So I can see there being quite good bits fodder for Exodites. Like I say, alongside the dinosaurs and things, actually, there'd be quite good kit bashes there.
I think that's definitely it's going to be expensive, but I think it will be totally worth it. Anyone who wants to do that, anyone who's listening and wants to do that, send your images to Gav first, and then send them to us so we can bring all the things. So we're very keen to see it. Oh my god!
Always up for cool pictures.
That's it.
Some people, you know, I do get sort of messages on Facebook, probably more than Twitter, but you know, sending photos of people like who've modelled a character from a book or even just painted. You know, it's like, oh, cool, I've just read Ravenwing and I've just decided to start collecting the Ravenwing army or whatever. That's always nice. Although I feel slightly guilty because everyone ends up saying, "Oh no, I had to buy a Dark Ages army because I read your book." Well, never mind. I don't get commission, but. Yeah.
It's the inspiration that keeps people going.
Yeah.
So before we start to wrap up for the night, just for Scotty, I just want to ask. So on a scale of 1 to complete traitors, where are the Dark Angels sitting?
I've got to be careful with this because I did something similar. I can't remember.
I've seen your heretic, your picture on Twitter. I think it was Twitter. You held it up. Dark Angels heretics, yes.
Yeah, there was I can't remember. I was doing a podcast for, and we were talking about Dark Angels, and one of the guys was a big Dark Angels fan, and so they'd primed him to ask if I collect Dark Angels myself, and my reply was, no, I don't collect traitors. And he went silent for about 30 seconds.
Just shut him down.
Well, yeah, but then we had a long conversation about it, you know, more nuanced conversation about the Dark Angels and their loyalties and the background and all the rest of it and stuff. But unfortunately, they experienced technical issues with the sound at the time, and all of that ended up getting cut from the original.
Oh no!
So basically, it just included me just basically saying the Dark Angels are traitors.
And then it was just like this really choppy audio of Gav just going, it's like, yep, total traitors.
Yeah.
Yep.
Trade.
I actually just finished reading Angels of Caliban this week.
Right. Yeah.
And it's, I don't know, man. Like you've done an amazing job, but they're not so cut dry. You know, fallen traitor, bad guy, good guy sort of scenario. It's very multifaceted. I can't quite figure it out.
Yeah. Well, that I mean, the third book, also in Legacy of Caliban, is a similar kind of idea, in that in The Unforgiven, because it has Azrael as one of the point of view characters, and him making not the realization, but kind of conveying the idea that hunting the hunt for the fallen started for bad reasons. Really, they lied about stuff. But 10,000 years on, if that lie comes out, it could destroy the Imperium. So suddenly the lie and what started it has turned into not a noble cause, but a necessary cause, and actually balancing that, the idea that because if some, if the Dark Angels were seen as heretics by some, that shake the foundations of the faith for many worlds and the Imperium and things like that, but also elements of the Inquisition, other spaceman chapters would go after them, which would require a retaliation, and it would start another civil war, potentially, like Fourth Quadrant Rebellion and even bigger. And so that's at the heart of The Unforgiven, the story, and Azrael sort of like having to balance that tightrope between what's right for the Imperium and what's right for the Dark Angels, but understanding that there's a Venn diagram there actually now. After 10,000 years of this secrecy, keeping the secrecy has become an end in its own right, but not just for the Dark Angels, but for the good of the Imperium. So yes, so is that traitorous? Yes and no.
I feel like we have to bring you back on.
Years ago, then that would have been fine. The problem is somebody, they chose to kind of create this lie, to create this false narrative, and actually now it's incumbent upon them to keep spinning the plate to keep it going, because otherwise it will come crashing down, and that would be bad for everyone. So although it's an evil of their own creation in a way, it's now become a necessary evil. So yeah, I mean,
necessary evil to keep the status quo.
Dude, we're gonna have to do another whole show just on Dark Angels.
We have to bring Gav on for a Dark Angel show. So, Gav, did you want to come on for another show later on down the track to just talk about Dark Angels?
Yeah, I can definitely do that.
Yes.
I'm so happy right now.
Because we are kicking the 2 hour mark, and it has been absolutely amazing talking to you. But I think we'll cut it there for the night. If that's okay. Everyone, definitely go check out Gav's new book. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight. That has been 2 hours of absolute pure Eldar lore. I apologize profusely for the technical issues at the start and for having to put up with my face for like a good 15, 16 minutes. It would have been very uninviting for a lot of new viewers. But we're all here. It's all audio. It's all done. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you, and we can't wait to have you back on to talk about Eldar. So that's it from us.
I don't know if you guys can tell.
Great to chat to you.
Absolutely. Was that Toddy?
I said, I don't know if you guys can tell. I am smiling. My screen's frozen, and it has been for like the last hour, where I'm just kind of like pouting at Gav. But I am happy to be here.
Just scowling thoroughly. All right, well, that's it from us, from Aushammer. Tune in a fortnight's time for the next fantastic episode. Check out our Facebook, check out our Twitter that we never man, and definitely check out, did I say Facebook? Definitely check out our Facebook, because there's memes galore, and there'll be heaps more Dark Angels trader memes coming up very soon for some reason. All right, guys. Peace out. See you guys in a bit.
Bye.
See you guys.
Stopping the broadcast.